Hello, welcome to 30 Minutes. I'm Rick Anthony. The Civil War has been memorialized and in some cases romanticized in books, song, films, TV epics, art, and enactment of battles by enthusiasts in authentic uniforms, right down to the buttons on their breeches. However, a new book brings to life the horror of the conflict between the states that was measured by the 1.2 million casualties and 620,000 deaths caused by a combination of new weaponry and medieval medicine. The book is Healing a Divided Nation: How the American Civil War Revolutionized Western Medicine. The author is Carole Adrienne, a good friend who's with us today to talk about the book and the documentary film she's been working on the same subject that preceded the book. Welcome, Carole.
Thanks, Rick.
Always good to see
here.
you. It was some time ago that we were together talking about the documentary, at least a couple of years ago.
It was, and in fact, being on your show led to me hosting a show. So thank you. This is like coming full circle.
You're quite welcome, and you have a very successful show here on MLTV 21. The book is meticulous. What struck me, and it shouldn't have, but what struck me was the book is meticulously researched to chronicle not only the advancement of medicine, but the advancement of women and the advancement of Black Americans in the time. I shouldn't have been surprised because your father, Dr. Bernard Inkster, was also meticulous and fanatical about research. He was one of the best consultants I ever worked with. And of course, your mother, Rose DeWolf, a newspaper journalist, also did investigative reporting. So she, too, was accustomed to diving deep into the data to bring to life a story. So you come from good lineage. We'll go back to the book in a minute, but how did you develop this interest in the Civil War? Are there any family ties to the Civil War?
Actually, no, but I would say that it's my mom's fault because one night we were on the way to dinner and we were driving around Logan Circle, and she commented that the city of Philadelphia has more Civil War statuary than any city in the country. And I thought about it, and I wondered why, because I knew that no battles had been fought in Philadelphia, and I couldn't stop wondering. So the next day, I was at the Central Library in Philadelphia doing research for a documentary I had intended to make about music and the brain, and they had wonderful subscription databases. So I started Googling Philadelphia Civil War, and it came up that Philadelphia was the center of medicine of the United States during the Civil War. Most of the doctors, North and South, trained here at University of Pennsylvania or Jefferson, and the two largest military hospitals in the North were here. It was a huge story, and I thought, someone must have made a documentary about this. And I looked it up and could find no evidence of it.
Not a book either?
Books, yes, but not a documentary, which is my medium.
Yes.
And so I was actually pretty reluctant to take it on, not having studied the war or being a real history buff in general. But I felt, to use an old-fashioned word, that the story had been vouchsafed to me. It landed in my lap, and it was so big and so intense. Somebody had to tell it.
Carole, people take graduate courses to learn how to do research. It seemed to have come naturally to you.
I had done research because my church, Old St. Joseph's National Shrine in Philadelphia, had the pastor at the time, Father William Waters, had some cartons of papers going back a few centuries, and he asked me to organize them to set up in archives. And so I visited several libraries and archives and interviewed the people in charge, who were very generous with their information, and learned an awful lot about doing research. And then when I came into the Civil War, I found out Philadelphia actually has more libraries and archives than any American city but Washington, D.C. And there were specializations. So I spent more than 4 years going from institution to institution through papers and memorabilia, diaries, letters, old publications, and my heart just went to it. It was such an incredible story of compassion, dedication, and heroism.
At one time, there was a small Civil War museum in Philadelphia. Does it still exist?
It doesn't. The materials do, and I think they are kind of in flux. It was on Pine Street.
Yes.
Yes.
I remember. Wasn't it a three-story?
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
And they had a mask of Lincoln?
Yes.
Yeah.
The death mask.
Yeah.
Yes. They had wonderful stuff.
They did.
And last I heard, I think it had been put into storage. I'm not sure exactly what the plan is or if it has been moved, but I'm sure that it has been carefully stored, though it was very valuable.
You know, as a quick aside, Philadelphia has done a terrible job of showcasing its history. I think. It could be a little Williamsburg, the old city. If somebody had some imagination and money, the money could be found. The government always has money, our money, but they always have money. But I've always been disappointed in the way Philadelphia has presented itself, the history of the city, and showcasing it.
I think you're right. I think if I were a tourist or I didn't know, I've been inured, in depth in it for so long that I know where stuff is, and I've discovered, we have amazing institutions here. The Library Company of Philadelphia, not part of the Free Library, although established by Benjamin Franklin. It's one of the largest strongholds of American cultural history in the country. 8 stories and an amazing staff.
Nobody knows about it.
Well,
you and 3 other people.
Well, it's never crowded.
Let me go to the book. The Healing of a Divided Nation, How the American Civil War Revolutionized Western Medicine. It's really a good read. There's one passage in the introduction that I thought did a pretty good job as a précis of what the book is all about, because there are several themes that run through the book. Medicine, discrimination,
literacy
against women and blacks at the time, and how they had to fight to take their place. Anyway, this passage in the bottom of, whoops, that's the wrong page. On the bottom, Civil War Signal. Could you read that passage?
Sure.
You should be able to do it from memory.
Historical reading glasses. The Civil War signaled a huge shifting of the tectonic plates of caste, ending slavery in America and forever changing the societal position of women. In the stinking vat of violence and disease that was the war in America, another movement was stirring. The suffering mass of humanity that constituted the armies began to arouse the citizens' nonpartisan concern, inspiring the creation of solutions and salves. Women, shaking off their mantles of second-class citizenship, led the way, presenting a strong new image of female ability and worth. Women streamed onto the battlefields and into the hospitals, took over running businesses, and organized training for skilled nurses. A culture that had not previously welcomed them suddenly found their support to be invaluable. Women, in their wartime work, challenged the sentimental domestic idea of weak and frail beings and continued to do so after the war.
Now, as you started to conceptualize, based on the early research you did you anticipate that these other 2 themes would develop, the advancement of women and blacks?
Never.
As physicians and no?
Never. It was shocking to me. And it was a 180 change for both women and African Americans. Yes. It certainly ended slavery, but what it did was open other doors, not easily, for...
Well, because of the need. We didn't have enough doctors, and we certainly didn't have, they didn't even call them nurses back then. not quite. Nurse meant something else, I think, back then.
A nurse meant usually a soldier who was too ill to fight. It was not a profession
Correct.
in this country at the time. So it's the beginning of professional nursing.
We'll get into that in a minute. Well, the American Red Cross was a product of the Civil War, right?
Yes, it was quite a few years after the war,
Yes.
but the International Committee of the Red Cross is pretty directly related.
What was the precursor to the Red Cross? There was a committee on sanitation.
The United States Sanitary Commission,
Yes.
I guess, could definitely be considered part of the prelude to the American Red Cross. It was a volunteer organization. It was huge, and it did what the government could not. The government had not prepared for supplies and delivery, manufacturing, ambulances.
Well, nobody expected the war to go on for 4 years, right?
No, it was supposed to be over.
Yeah. Yeah. As you got into, as you immersed yourself in it, and I know you did,
You're right.
I think you think, certainly the documentary, because you worked on that for how many years?
Too many to
Too many
count,
years.
but it was a real,
Well, 4 years of research.
yeah.
Yeah. But as you got into this, other authors I've talked to have said that in their subjects, whether it was fiction or whatever, at some point the book began to write itself. Did this book begin to write itself as you got into it?
I think that the story began to tell itself. And the writing was a lot of work.
Yeah.
But the story was so passionate. The story just grabbed me by the throat, and I couldn't stop. And the book was kind of a nice release because I had met so many people through my research for the documentary. And the book allowed me to go take a much deeper dive into some of their stories and histories and effect. And that was really a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
So I have cried in many archives across the city.
Yeah. No, you got right down to their shoelaces in some cases in describing some of the principal characters. The pages are punctuated with excerpts from memoirs, letters, other publications. You must have had a struggle when you were this deep in data, research data, and deciding what to use and what not to use. How did you select the excerpts that you have in the book?
Some things just leapt out and demanded to be put in print. So I think, I don't know, some statements were just so strong. There's a statement that Susie King Taylor, who was born into slavery, and she was literate. She had worked since she was 6 years old to gain literacy illegally. And she was at one point in a union-held settlement where she taught people to read. And she talked about how she taught children during the day, but she said at night, the adults came to her. And she said, they came to me, all of them, to learn to read above all else. And I thought, it just gave me chills again.
Yeah.
So if it gave me chills, it made it into the book.
You also became quite expert, and I don't know if this was, you foresaw this, in the tools of war. Your description of some of the artillery and the advancements in rifles and so on was really quite interesting.
Oh, good.
Let me just give you a couple of words and phrases and ask you to just comment on each one. I'm not sure how you pronounce this. Is it in the Miniball or is it French Miniball?
I think in America it's Miniball.
Miniball, M-I-N-I-E ball.
Yes, with an accent.
Yeah, which was, with the accent. Which was what? And how did it change some aspects of warfare?
Oh, it changed the face of battle and warfare. It really, it was major. The ammunition of choice for the smoothbore muskets that had been used for a couple centuries really was a round ball. It looked like a big marble, and it was generally made out of lead, sometimes stone. and inserted into the far end of the gun. But a French army officer, Carole Adrienne, invented something, despite being called the Miniball, it's really shaped, it's bullet shaped, and it was rifled at the bottom. And they changed the guns where they cut a spiral groove inside the barrel of the gun. Now, you may have seen sometimes if you watch old Westerns and they're loading those rifles, and they take the Miniball and they wrap it in a piece of fabric before they do it. Well, that was to keep it from rocketing around and ricocheting inside the barrel, which would interfere with the trajectory. So this rifling, where the rifling inside the barrel grabbed the rifling on that Miniball, and this thing, it increased the range and the accuracy and the speed of that projectile. And it is assumed that the Miniball itself caused 90-some% of the gunshot wounds in the Civil War.
It shattered bones and pulverized flesh.
You're exactly right. The doctors said pulpified the muscles. Yes, it did incredibly terrible damage.
All right, let's try the Gatling gun.
The Gatling gun. Richard Jordan Gatling was an inventor, and he invented a lot of things that really advanced agriculture in America, a drill for planting wheat, and he made a small fortune. Well, he was 27 on a business trip, and he contracted smallpox. Now, he did recover, but he thought, I'm going to go to medical school now. So he attended medical school in Ohio. But when he got out, he really felt the call to, he was an inventor at heart, but he could see how the soldiers were suffering from diseases and these terrible wounds. And he wanted, he was a medical doctor, and he wanted to end the suffering. So he wanted to invent a gun that would be so powerful that it would alleviate the need for large armies. So he attached 6 rifle barrels to a metal cylinder that was cranked by hand. Now, the smoothbore muskets could fire 2 to 3 rounds a minute. The rifled muskets could fire about 20 rounds a minute, and the Gatling gun could fire 200 rounds a minute. So it is the great-granddaddy of all the assault rifles today, the Gatling gun.
But he really thought that the use of his gun, this innovation, would change the way war was fought, fewer soldiers, and therefore fewer wounds.
Yes.
It didn't work out that way.
No, it didn't. But I thought it's kind of interesting to know that the medical doctor who invented that terrible weapon had in mind that it would end that kind of warfare.
Yeah. I wonder if he regretted it.
He wrote about it afterward. He was honored, and he did work on perfecting it. They named a ship after him, I think, in World War I.
I remember reading that. USS Gatling. Yeah.
But his intention was to stop the battles.
All right, let's try the repeating rifle.
Another amazing innovation. And actually, that one led to a story I like about Lincoln. Christopher Minor Spencer of Connecticut was another innovative genius. And he, even as a child, he was interested in guns and machines, and he worked on all different things, and he invented a lot of things for a silk mill where he worked. Well, he had an idea for a repeating rifle, and he worked on that for a while, and he came up with something that was really reliable. So, as inventors tended to do at the time, he traveled to Washington with this gun to show it to President Lincoln. This tells you a little about how accessible the president was at that time. So he went to the White House, and although this says several things about Lincoln, although the city of Washington, D.C. had strict laws forbidding the firing of guns inside the city limits. But I always imagine Lincoln as like, I'm shooting this thing. So Lincoln, a naval aide, and Christopher Spencer walked to a little park across the street from the White House, and they set up a crude pine target, and Lincoln shot this gun. he was really impressed. He hit the mark over and over. It repeated. It was really impressive. So when they got back to the White House, he presented Christopher Spencer with a fragment of that crude pine target. And I thought, Lincoln understood superstardom. you know? But he sent the gun to the Army and Navy for reviews. They loved it. And pretty soon, thousands of Spencer repeating rifles were delivered to Union troops.
Well beyond the Civil War.
Yes.
Yeah. Why do you refer to Lincoln as, and I'm quoting, an icon of Civil War medicine? You do indicate in the book that he was interested in all kinds of innovations and tinkering with things. But why medicine particularly?
Lincoln really gave the okay for a lot of things. For one, his was the final okay to allow Major Jonathan Letterman to develop an ambulance corps, which had never been available in this country. There were no ambulances. And that really changed so much when they were able to then get wounded off the field within 12 hours. But he gave the okay for a lot of people to develop new weapons, new equipment, new treatments. He was, I'm not going to say that he was hands-on, but he was very aware. And interestingly, like, he really kept up with recent developments. The New York Times, he read Scientific American, they said cover to cover. And anytime he was out traveling and he saw something on a farm that was a different piece of equipment, his friends, the lawyers, said he would climb under it to see how it
Down
worked.
on the floor. So,
But he gave permission for the United States Sanitary Commission to become as effective an organization as it was. So I think he was the big okay on a lot of the things that moved things forward.
Well, and yet the treatment after he was shot was so bad because they didn't have anything else. They couldn't save him.
It is one absolutely true way to look at it. And the other thing that I have to keep reminding myself sometimes, that was the best medicine available at the time. They really did not know what to do. And they would clear the clotting, and it had an effect on his breathing. I mean, he lived a long time after being shot in the head. And they used something called the Melton Probe. It had been invented in Paris. It was a long, slender piece of metal with a porcelain bulb on one end, and the porcelain was unglazed. And they would insert this thing into a wound if it was, because a finger was considered the best.
Yes.
You know, they wanted to find out, is there a bullet in there or is it bone? And so if the probe came out with a mark on this white porcelain, they knew it was the lead of ammunition on there. And if not, they assumed that it was bone that had been pushed deep. So I know it really, it's so crude when you read about what went on with Lincoln, but then these were some of the top doctors in the country. Well, at the start of the Civil War, it's estimated that maybe 300 doctors had ever witnessed surgery or seen a gunshot wound. So
unbelievable. And that was in the country, North and South.
Yes.
Right. Although the North had more doctors than the South, right?
Well, the North had more men, period. Yeah. But most of them, even the Southerners, had trained in Philadelphia.
Yeah, I was surprised, I don't know why, by the population distribution. 29 million in the North, and I've forgotten what the South.
I think about 9 million in the South.
Yeah. And that's quite a disparity.
It was.
When you go to war.
Do you know what, though? It made a huge difference to dentistry, because the Confederates could not afford men who couldn't fight because of problems with their teeth. So they made a point of inducting as many dentists as possible and having them in as many regiments as possible. And the North really didn't want to hear it about dentists, and they took a lot of pressure, the medical corps, to add a dental corps. And throughout the war, the Union refused. So
Wasn't William, is it Moron, M-O-R-O-N, wasn't he a dentist?
Morton?
Morton.
William Thomas Green Morton?
Yeah.
Yes, he was a dentist. He had wanted to be a doctor. He was the really considered one of the discoverers of the use of anesthesia.
Yes.
And the dentists who served in the Union Army frequently were brought in as surgeons.
Uh-huh.
But he would go out on the field after a battle, and he would administer anesthesia to the guys lying there waiting to be rescued to give them a window from pain.
Dr. Alexander Thomas Augusta.
Defining the word hero. He was born in Norfolk, Virginia, about 1825, and he was freeborn to parents of color. But the horrible laws in some of the southern states at the time made education illegal for African American, freeborn or enslaved. And so he apparently met and saw a couple doctors in action when he was a kid, and he felt that calling. But he was so conflicted because in order to get into medical school, he was going to have to learn how to read and write. So at some point, he made his way to Baltimore to work as a barber. And he met some people there who agreed to secretly tutor him. He was a quick learner. He became literate very quickly, but he was refused admission to American medical schools owing to the color of his skin. So he married a woman with whom he had a wonderful partnership, and moved to Toronto, Canada, where the situation was very different for African Americans. He was accepted into a medical school there, and he opened a pharmacy in the city to support himself and his wife and his education while he was learning. So he was in school in Toronto for 6 years. When he graduated, the dean said he was one of the most brilliant students ever. And he became the head of the Toronto City Hospital, which really, it tells you so much about the difference in segregation, really. And when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in the States in 1863, Dr. Augusta wrote to the president and offered his services as a doctor to the black troops, which were being called up at that time. And he had a hard time. He hit more walls and doors that were slammed in his face. They said, okay, no, never mind, yes, come, don't come, broke appointments. Finally, after months, he was commissioned into the Army by President Lincoln as a major. And when he left the Army, he went as a brevet lieutenant colonel. So that tells you a lot. But he has a list of firsts, Dr. Augusta. Well, when I think about it later, I thought, he could at any point have gone back to Canada and said, look, I'm going back where I'm respected. Yeah. And he didn't. He felt an obligation to people of color in America to be there for them. He became the first black hospital administrator in America, the first black medical school faculty member at Howard University. And when he died, he was the first African-American officer to be interred at Arlington National Cemetery. He was awesome.
There's so much to cover. I want to be sure to ask about the nuns and the role they played on the battlefield, not just in the hospitals, but going out in the battlefield.
At the time of the Civil War, because there were no nursing schools in America, and actually there weren't any until well after the war, the only group of women who had any organized training in the care of patients were the Catholic nuns. And they volunteered like crazy. And they would treat patients with communicable diseases like smallpox and yellow fever. They did go onto the battlefields. Largely, they staffed the hospitals, and they staffed the hospital ships, which was a real change for the Navy. But they decided to allow them. And there were thousands of lives owed to those nuns.
The book is just chock full of really interesting stories, heroes, heroines, It's really good reading, and we've run out of time. I wish we had more time because I had more questions. Thank you so much. It's been nice to have you back.
Oh, you too, Rick. Thank you.
Carole Adrienne has been our guest today. Again, the book is Healing a Divided Nation, How the American Civil War Revolutionized Western Medicine. This is 30 Minutes. I am Rick Anthony. Until next time, take very good care of yourselves